The concept of the adaptive boundary is founded upon simple principles of thermodynamics, physiology, and conservation of mass. We introduced the adaptive boundary in the context of the cell, where the cell membrane constitutes the boundary between the cell's internal and external environments. Included in the membrane are various sorts of machines, including engines to do work to reduce the entropy inside the cell, and to manage the flows of matter and energy across the membrane. Also included in the membrane is what we have called a cognitive engine. These are devices for sensing the environment and for manipulating the adaptive boundary to produce a specific outcome, the specified orderliness of the cell's internal environment. The idea of the adaptive boundary is very powerful because it can be scaled up almost without limit. And this gives us an interesting insight into the nature of adaptation generally and of evolutionary adaptation. We start by outlining a fundamental concept, so-called extended physiology. Let's start, as we did before, with an adaptive boundary, partitioning an interior environment from an exterior environment. Embedded within the adaptive boundary is a pump, which pumps potassium into the interior and exports sodium to the exterior. If the pump is not active, concentrations of both sodium and potassium will be uniform across the adaptive boundary. We'll represent concentration with size of the symbols. We'll also represent the uniformity of concentration with a field of uniform color. If no work is being done, entropy is uniformly high across the boundary. There is no entropy gradient across the membrane, in other words. As the pump begins to work, however, potassium concentration in the interior starts to increase. Sodium concentration on the outside also starts to increase. Now remember that conservation of mass applies here. For every atom of potassium pumped in, one atom of potassium is removed from the exterior. And the same holds true for sodium. For every sodium atom exported from the interior, this adds an atom of sodium to the exterior. Gradually a concentration difference appears, but with an interesting wrinkle. The work of the adaptive boundary alters the environment not just within the cell, but external to the cell as well. There's nothing magical at work here, it's just a consequence of the conservation of mass. This underscores an important point about adaptive boundaries. The physiological function does not just partition environments, rather the physiological function spans the adaptive boundary, altering the environment on both sides. Specifically, the low entropy that develops within the cell is mirrored by a low entropy environment that develops outside the cell as well. Thus, the pool of low entropy does not just include the interior of the cell, it is imposed external to the cell as well. The physiological function of the adaptive boundary, therefore, is extended beyond the interior of the cell. Keep that word in mind, extended. The concept of extended physiology feeds into a larger concept, the extended organism. An organism is constructed from cells, in which entropy is held low and fixed. This is another way of saying that the interior of the cell maintains a high and highly specified orderliness, which we've color-coded as green. The environment external to the cell is the fluid environment contained within the organism, the so-called extracellular fluid. Compared to the cell's interior, the extracellular environment is high entropy, so there's an entropy gradient across the cell membrane. There are energy costs associated with maintaining the persistent orderliness within the cell. Specifically, the energy cost of doing so will be proportional to the entropy gradient. As we just saw, the larger the entropy gradient, the more energy it costs the cell to sustain its specified orderliness. Let's graph this out. Here's a graph of entropy versus location, external and internal. The entropy gradient across the membrane will look something like this. High entropy outside with an abrupt transition to low entropy within the cell. The cost of sustaining the cell's orderliness is proportional to the gradient. If external entropy goes up, the cost will also go up. This is for a steady and uniform external environment indicated by the flatness of the line outside the cell. If the external environment is variable as suggested by the jagged line, this adds another interesting wrinkle. Because the external entropy is difficult to predict, this makes cost of sustaining the cell's internal entropy also difficult to predict. And there's still more wrinkles. Remember that the adaptive boundary lowers the entropy on both sides of the membrane, so this will produce a sort of a halo of low entropy around the cell, which we've color-coded in blue. For what's next, we need to define gradient more precisely. A gradient, as opposed to a difference, represents a change over distance. Without the halo, the gradient is steep, spanning a distance no wider than the thickness of the membrane. But with a halo, the gradient is shallower, and the cost of sustaining the cell's interior orderliness is lessened. And this adds yet another wrinkle about how adaptive boundaries partition environments. If the cell membrane is the adaptive boundary, the internal environment is contained within the cell, and the external environment is everything outside the cell. But the effect of the adaptive boundary extends beyond the cell membrane. This helps lower the costs to the cell of sustaining itself. This halo of low entropy is ephemeral, however, but it can be secured if it can be contained somehow. Organisms do this with sheets of cells that form what's called an epithelium. Epithelia are also fundamental building blocks of organisms. Our lungs are lined with epithelia, so are our intestines, so too is our nervous system. In fact, we can think of organisms as essentially highly folded groups of epithelia. Epithelia can form their own adaptive boundaries. Now, the epithelium can impose orderliness on what formerly had been the cell's external environment. The cell's external environment has now become an internalized environment. And there is now a new external environment that has been pushed to the other side of the epithelial adaptive boundary. Now, here's the important point. Adaptive barriers can nest within one another, and in doing so can bring ever more extensive environments under adaptive control. The nesting of adaptive boundaries vastly extends the concept of the organism. When we hear the word organism, we see an animal or a plant. The idea of the organism is so familiar to us that we rarely pause to consider just what an organism is, though. We have a vague idea that an organism is something that's contained within a skin of some sort. But we can use the idea of extended physiology to recast the organism in a different way, as a set of nested adaptive boundaries, a set of extensively folded epithelia. It doesn't stop there. Epithelia are the first set in an organizational hierarchy of the organism. You have a cell, which is bounded by the adaptive boundary of the cell membrane. Cells work together to create new adaptive boundaries in the form of tissues, epithelia generally. For their part, tissues enter into collaborations to form organs like kidneys or hearts or skin. Each represents its own adaptive boundary. Organs form into higher order adaptive boundaries that we can call organ systems. These include things like organs that work together, like hearts and lungs together. And finally, all of this is wrapped up in the outermost adaptive boundary of the organism, which divides it from the environment. At each step of the hierarchy, work has to be done to help sustain persistence of an internalized environment. This hierarchy is probably what you learned in your biology classes in high school or college. Your textbooks usually stop there. However, the logic of extended physiology means there's no reason to stop at the outermost boundary of the organism. The environment itself can be an adaptive boundary. The environment and organism can form an extended organism, in other words. Well, that's a radical idea. Let's put some flesh on it. One of the most obvious examples of an extended organism is the common earthworm. We're all familiar with earthworms, yet there's something peculiar about them. To understand what, we need to delve a little bit into their physiology. Earthworms are part of the phylum Annelida. Annelid worms live either in freshwater or seawater, but there are no terrestrial annelids. But what about earthworms? Well, that's the paradox. The physiological challenges for adaptation are different in each habitat. For a freshwater worm, water tends spontaneously to flood into the body. To stay in water balance, earthworms have to export water as fast as it comes in. This, by the way, is the same thing that happens in us when we drink a lot of water. Our kidneys step in to get rid of that excess water. Earthworms have kidneys of their own, which I've caricatured in these little squiggly bits in each segment. For annelid worms that live in seawater, the physiological challenge is different. In seawater, water is drawn continuously out of the worm's body. Their kidneys have to be structured toward an entirely different aim, namely water conservation. Now, here's the peculiar bit. An earthworm lives in a drying environment. That is, earthworms face the same adaptive problems that marine worms do. You would expect then that earthworm kidneys should look like kidneys of worms from seawater. That is, you would expect earthworm kidneys would be structured toward water conservation. You'd be in for a surprise, however, because earthworm kidneys look like the kidneys of freshwater annelids. In other words, earthworms are actually freshwater annelid worms that have moved into soil. That's why I put the earth part into scare quotes. Furthermore, earthworms have made the move into soil without their kidneys evolving to adapt to their new drying conditions. How do they do that? Earthworms do this by acting as an extended organism. Let's build this up piece by piece. We start with a cell, separated from its external environment by the cell membrane. This is going to get complicated, so let's give these environments numbers, just to keep them all straight. We'll designate the cell's internal environment as E0, and we'll designate the external environment as E1. The cell membrane forms the adaptive boundary between them, and we'll call that B1. The earthworm's cells are situated behind another adaptive boundary consisting of the cells of the kidney epithelium. We'll call this boundary B2. The kidney epithelium folds up to form a blind-ended tubule that opens to the outside environment. This is what the B2 adaptive boundary looks like at that scale. Each segment has one of these, and this is what constitutes the earthworm's kidney. E1, populated by the cells of the worm's body, is therefore partitioned from a new environment within the kidney tubule, which we'll designate as E2. Each segment of the earthworm contains its own kidney, and here's what that looks like in cartoon form. We still have an environment, E1, separated from another environment, E2, and the adaptive boundary is B2 again. The extended organism part involves the soil environment the worm inhabits. In the absence of worms, when a dry column of soil is wetted by rains, only the topmost layers of the soil will be moistened. Once that rain passes, that water either will run off or evaporate away, leaving the soil dry. Add worms to the soil, and what follows is a restructuring of the soil environment. It becomes more open, richer in organic content, and more, all of which allows rains to penetrate more deeply and to be held more tightly in the soils. The earthworms, in other words, have restructured the soil to make it wetter, more aquatic. In short, the earthworms have turned the soil into a new adaptive boundary, B3, which creates a new environment designated as E3. The soil has now been co-opted as part of the extended physiology of the earthworm's water balance. Let's now return to the big question, namely adaptation. From an extended organism perspective, adaptation takes on quite a different color. Let's remind ourselves again of the definition of adaptation. It is a tendency to aptitude. But that leaves the question hanging. Aptitude to what? The common way to think about adaptation is the organism adapting to an environment. Suppose we have this problem of how you get essentially a freshwater worm to start inhabiting dry soil. For the worm to adapt to drier conditions might mean evolving a new kidney. This is likely to be a very lengthy process. But the extended organism idea opens up another possibility. Remember that the physiology of an adaptive boundary extends beyond the boundary itself. This makes adaptation a process that occurs across adaptive boundaries. The boundaries are, in a word, fuzzy. What follows is an entirely different means of adaptation. In addition to an organism adapting to an environment, an organism can also adapt the environment to itself. By restructuring the soil environment so that it holds water in a different way, the earthworm creates a new environment that makes it possible for a freshwater earthworm now to live in soil, where otherwise it could not inhabit. Keep this lesson in mind because it's very important. Adaptation is actually a two-way interaction between organism and environment. I like to describe it as a physiological conspiracy, in the literal sense that conspiracy means to breathe together. In the extended organism idea, environment and organism are inseparable.